This is Mrs. Broadrib with another podcast for all those students out there studying AQA GCSE Geography. This week I'm going to focus on climatic hazards, and we're going to look at a tropical storm in a HIC, a higher income country, and we're going to focus on Hurricane Irma. Like usual, there are resources to go along with this. So if you're my class, they will be on Google Classroom. If you don't know me and you'll just randomly come across this, there is a website link to go with this where I shall put some presentation slides and help. So let's actually think about the GCSE specification, AQA Geography. First of all, we've got one aim: to know the primary and secondary effects of a tropical storm. Now let's have a recap. We did this last week. A primary effect is something that happens immediately. So there will be flooding, homes will be flooded. That's an immediate effect. A secondary effect is what happens afterwards. So these homes that are flooded, well, then these people are homeless for a while. They can't move straight back into them. They've got to be cleaned up. They'll have to be repaired. So that's your secondary impact. These people who may even be homeless for months, maybe even a year, whilst they repair and whilst they renovate their homes. So there's one aim we're going to look at today. The other thing we're going to look at is the immediate and long-term responses to a tropical storm. So what happens immediately? Immediately there could be the Coast Guard there and they're rescuing people, something happening immediately. Or maybe then the long-term responses, a sea wall is built to combat the great big sea surge. So we're going to focus on these two aims today, and this is on destruction, and I've got some key questions to go along there. How strong was the wind? What were the sea impacts in terms of social, economic and environmental? And then also to think about the level of development of the places affected, because Hurricane Irma did strike Florida, the United States, but it struck over 13 more lower income countries of the Caribbean, such as Barbuda, such as the British Virgin Islands, which we're going to have a closer look at. So let's have another little think generally about HICs versus LICs. Higher income countries like Florida, we can argue, are better prepared. Perhaps people know that it's coming. They actually have great warning systems, prediction methods. They have evacuation planned. More lower income places, this is a little bit harder to actually achieve sometimes. They might not have the resources, may not actually be able to prepare as well as the people in Florida. And that can have a huge impact on the outcome, and a reason sometimes why the devastation can be worse in lower income countries. Okay, on slide number 9, I've got an effects table. So Hurricane Irma wreaked damage. It sadly killed people, 134 to be precise. It cost a whopping 300 billion in a repair bill for the clean-up, for people just going about improving their homes. So let's look at this effects table here and think about the social, economic and environmental impacts, because 6 months after Irma, people were still living in government shelters. They actually couldn't return to their homes. They were reliant on aid. And this, if you listened to the podcast last week, is reminiscent of Haiti. People there were relying on aid still. They were living in temporary shelters because they don't actually have the resources and the money to repair quick enough. Some of the other impacts you'll see on this table is like Barbuda, 90% of all structures. That's businesses, that's schools, that's health centres, and of course homes, 90% damaged or destroyed. Now these islands rely on tourism. So if you've got 90% of all your structures destroyed, and one of those is your cafe, your hotels, your villas, your businesses related to tourism, how are you ever going to actually repair? Because if the thing that brings you in money, if your economy is dependent on tourism and your tourist related businesses are destroyed, how are you actually going to earn money to repair them? They're in what we call this cycle of actually they can't get out of. They'll need aid to help them, an investment from abroad to help them repair. St. Martin was even worse than Barbuda, with 95% was destroyed, including the airport. So think about these Caribbean islands. The British Virgin Islands were another one. These Caribbean islands were significantly affected economically because their main source of income is tourism, And if 95% and 90% of your structures are damaged, then you're not actually going to be able to have your lovely visitors come back and spend money and create jobs. So I'm going to stop for a minute and I'm going to ask you to look at that effects table. I'm going to ask you to social, economic and environment it, and I'm also going to ask you to actually apply the primary and secondary. What happened immediately and what actually were the impacts that happened later on. I'm going to pause, take a moment please, and get your head around those effects. Okay. Let's now think of the second aim and objective of this GCSE specification, which was to actually know the difference between the immediate and the long-term responses. On the slides, on slide 12, I've got an interview with actually one of the American admirals. One of the great immediate responses was the American Navy sent ships out to the Caribbean, and they're trying to run rescues and helicopter drops. They're there trying to actually rebuild the harbours because, of course, there was a storm surge of over 13 feet, and actually the docks and the harbours where boats land at these Caribbean islands were destroyed. So you've got some idea of some of the brilliant kind of immediate responses. Lots of aid agencies they just started to help massively with bottled water, with food, with tents. People, like just random people who ran businesses that had boats, went to try to evacuate people off these Caribbean islands. The actual initial immediate outpouring was amazing, but the longer term responses have been harder. They can't build seawalls. They can't actually respond as well in lower income countries because firstly, they're quite low lying. And secondly, actually, they don't have the responses and the resources to be able to purchase it. So take a moment and look at slide 17. On slide 17, you've got a mixture of images from America and Florida, top right, with the boats that were sunk in the harbour. Then you've got some images to the left from Barbuda. You've got some images in the middle from the British Virgin Islands. And you can just see the telegraph poles were out and people there in Cuba were just trying just to move things by hand. You can see the devastation. How can we actually respond to this in the long term? How can we actually try to stop these things actually happening again? Well, we can definitely have some evacuation plans in place. We can actually try and make sure that people know what to do. They board up their windows. They're able maybe to get to higher ground. If they're in Florida, they'll drive away from the area, maybe go and spend some time with relatives. So we can definitely have better warning systems. So we've just said that we can prepare, that we can actually try and predict. But the responses, if you're a lower income country, is really, really hard. You're going to need maybe to have actually stockpiled some supplies. You're going to need to perhaps have organised and maybe built in advance cyclone shelters. Now, this is one of the most effective things that they've actually done in Asia, where they suffer from tropical storms which are known as cyclones. Now, these cyclone shelters are really strong because they're made out of concrete and they're actually high. They're built on stilts so the sea surge and the storm surge and the waves will go underneath, but the people will be in the higher areas, so they'll be on the second and the third floors and they'll be protected. So if we can get some warning, if people can get themselves to these cyclone shelters, it makes a great big difference. Now, of course, there's a cost to this. These are concrete, they'll involve steel, these aren't cheap, but they can be built with aid and country support and they're going to last. It's a structure that won't just last 2 or 3 years, this will be around for years to come. So we've gone over some effects, we've thought about some responses. Now let's actually think about some skills. On slide 20, I've got a question for you. Assess the extent to which tropical storms have effects on people and the environment, and use a figure and an example you've studied. And actually the figure that you can see on slide number 19 is from Hurricane Irma. Look at the hillside, the vegetation stripped. Look at those containers. They just look like Lego bricks. They're actually huge containers like we see at Southampton docks. Scary, absolutely scary. So let's bug the question on slide 12. Box the command words, assess. So you're going to have to say to what extent, to a greater extent and to a lesser extent. My class we've been doing on the one hand, on the other hand. We've got some keywords there. We've obviously got the effects, these impacts, what has actually happened. And we've got people and the environment. So we know we're dealing socially like homelessness, and we're dealing with the environment, perhaps with the dirty floodwaters, the spread of diseases, the vegetation destroyed. So take a moment to read the model answers. Have a little what went well, www, and EBI, even better if moment now. This is a pretty good answer actually that was written by one of my students last year. And on slide 21, just actually look at this self-assessment grid. Actually, can we spot some of those things in here? Has this student got actual specific impacts? Have they got facts? Like I can see 95% of actually the island was destroyed. But what island are they talking about there? 13 Caribbean islands were affected. Actually, they haven't actually named the island. So start looking for what they've done well, but also what they could do better. And I want you to have a go. I want you to actually have a go at answering this question using that figure and the knowledge that you've got now. And if you're one of my students, well, ping it to me, email it to me, submit it through Google Classroom, or just come to one of the ESPs. So I'm going to finish this up now and leave you to carry on a bit more research on Hurricane Irma and do a practice question. It's really important you practice. And of course, these resources are going to be available for my class online on Google Classroom. But if you don't know me and you're a student out there taking AQA Geography, there's going to be a link to this podcast where you can get these slides. Take care, everybody, and see you again next week. Bye for now.